Before we begin, a brief introduction. The following video is actually a recording of a paper I wrote just about a year ago for a natural theology class. In some ways, this was a capstone to 2 extra years of study in philosophy. And so, from a desire to share it, I have adapted it to suit a more YouTube podcast style. Because of the nature of the paper, I must apologize to my frequent viewers who may have come to expect more visual gags. There may be some, but I'd recommend that you probably just listen to this rather than watch it. Still, I really do hope that this paper helps push forward some of the things that have been floating around, if you will, in my mind for the last couple of years. And I hope that it provides a good setup also for the main project of this channel, which will be coming out, let's say soon. But until that day, I hope to at least be able to continue to share my passion for contemporary philosophy and the deeper existential questions we all struggle with. And so, without further ado, I proudly present Edith Stein and the problem of ontotheology. On February 24th, 1957, in Germany, the world-famous philosopher Martin Heidegger delivered a lecture titled The Ontotheological Constitution of Metaphysics to conclude a seminar on his fellow German countryman, Hegel. Published in the book Writing Indifference, Heidegger's critique of all Western metaphysics prior to him would have a profound impact on future philosophical projects. Anything attempting to prove the existence of God was to be attacked. Heidegger's argument would be refined and then echoed by the French philosopher Jean Luc Marion in his work God Without Being, first published in 1982. And this work also continued to undermine traditional metaphysics. If Heidegger's claim that all metaphysics is ontotheological is true, then both philosophy and theology have become corrupted, and discourse surrounding God in both disciplines has committed the sin of metaphysical idolatry. The transcendence of God will have been forsaken, exchanging itself for philosophical concepts which reduce God to one being among many, and place him within a contradiction, that he is a self-caused entity on which all other entities receive their grounding. Ultimately, if both Heidegger and Marion are correct, the entirety of the metaphysical tradition before them appears to be wasted breath, and any attempts after them a fool's errand. While Heidegger's critique would significantly reshape the philosophical landscape of his time, a contemporary of his was taking a unique step toward uniting Christian scholastic Thomism with modern phenomenology. Only 7 years prior to Heidegger's lecture, the first edition of Edith Stein's philosophical magnum opus, Finite and Eternal Being, was published posthumously, its author having been martyred in a Nazi death camp. Despite its form as a metaphysical investigation, Stein's work stands outside the critique offered by Heidegger and further elaborated by Marion. An investigation into Stein's work and a vindication of it from the critique of ontotheology would reopen the door for metaphysical discourse within Catholic philosophy, a project promoted by Pope St. John Paul II in his encyclical letter Fides et Ratio. Therefore, this paper seeks to investigate the problem of ontotheology, primarily by defining it through the lens of Marion's 3 foundations of ontotheology. After demonstrating the problem This paper will investigate Edith Stein's proof for the existence of God in finite and eternal being. Having reviewed her argument, this paper then will show that none of the foundations of ontotheology apply to her work, and prove that Stein's proof for the existence of God is not a work of ontotheological metaphysics, nor does it fall under any of the categories of ontotheology defined by Marion. To understand, then, what ontotheology is, and why it is even a problem within philosophy, we must look at the conclusion that Heidegger reaches after proposing that all metaphysical thought is in fact ontotheological. Heidegger's radical claim here is that any God reached within an ontotheological system, and therefore any metaphysical system, ends in a, quote, God of philosophy. Man can neither pray nor sacrifice to this God. Man can neither fall to his knees in awe, nor can he play music and dance before this God. End quote. This argument follows from the composition of the ontotheological system itself. If God is placed within the defined category of just one entity among many, then he loses his radical transcendence that makes him worthy of our worship. God is reduced by metaphysics. He is reduced from being a creator, a savior, and a redeemer, and now simply becomes a function of human reason used to causally explain the mere existence of things. And he is also described as just being ever so slightly greater than them, but in a limited and rationalized, univocal way. If Heidegger's critique is correct, any and all metaphysics that tries to prove the existence of God does not give an account of God compatible with religious practice. Rather than a God who is deemed worthy of worship or active within the lives of men, we instead have a God who is sequestered away in the realm of concepts and causation. God becomes just one being among many others, whose purpose is to just make the philosophical system fit together. If there is this distinct difference between what philosophy reaches and calls God, and what theology and cult worship calls God, then all efforts of a marriage between faith and metaphysics should be considered fruitless. Therefore, we would have to exclude not only the attempts of philosophers like Hegel and Leibniz at proving the existence of God, but also that of all of the scholastic Catholic philosophical tradition found within the Middle Ages, which had first attempted to marry reason with revelation. So, we must look at the characteristics of what Heidegger even means when he says ontotheology. While Heidegger is the first person to critique metaphysics in this way, it may be beneficial for us to look at the work of Jean Luc Marion. In God Without Being, Marion provides a clear outline of how to determine a work as ontotheological. Marion offers 3 separate markers that not only help us understand how ontotheology comes to be, but also what it really is. The first foundation of ontotheology is summarized as God having been posited as an entity within the metaphysical system as a whole. By entity, the German word used by both Heidegger and Stein as Seins, we are meant to think of a particular being, not of being as a whole, or the active being as described in the verb sein. An example of an entity would be a tree, or a dog, or even a human. All of these are entities, marked as a particular instance of an act of being, which all derive this act from being as a whole. What has occurred then within the first pillar of ontotheology is that the being of God and the being of creatures has been treated univocally. God is not over and beyond any other entity. He is one himself. He falls under the category of entity. Although he may have infinite perfections or other attributes that we place in him as something above your typical entity, he still falls within the category that treats of all other things within existence. For Heidegger, this first foundation is the starting point that results in philosophy proposing a God unworthy of worship. The second foundation of ontotheology is that the God proposed within a metaphysical system as an entity is then used as the grounding of all other beings as their efficient cause. God becomes a conceptual anchor by which all other beings can be explained in lieu of him. However, this immediately seems to betray the transcendence of God demanded by theology. Examples of how this second pillar can be found in the history of philosophy are shown through during the European Enlightenment. Having sacrificed much of God's direct involvement with the world, apart from being its first cause, deism prevailed as a leading philosophy. This led to a God who was necessary within the realm of reason and metaphysics, but was quickly dismissed as being worthy of having faith in or worshiping. This extreme interpretation did not err in viewing God as an efficient cause, but rather that God's causal involvement in the world is univocally treated as the same as all other creatures' causal acts. Furthermore, many ontotheological systems reduce God in using him only for the purpose of explaining causal chains, a far cry from the God described and worshipped in religious practice. The third and final foundation of ontotheology is that the proposed God, who is an entity and ground for all other entities, is defined as self-causing, or causa sui. In the need for all entities to have a grounding to their existence, a cause that sufficiently explains how the entity came to be, it stands to reason that God would also need a reason for his existence as well, since he is just one entity among many others. The only possible explanation, then, is that he must be his own cause. With this final step, ontotheology shows its deepest flaw as a, quote, closed system, knowing its beginning and end before it ever begins the task of thinking, end quote. Having God be his own cause means that the inclusion of God within metaphysics results in an inescapable loop. This loop, for Heidegger, begs the question of how God could possibly simultaneously be the category of being from which all entities receive their ground, and also be accounted as the highest being, an entity within the system that depends on grounding. Following the steps laid out by Marion, a concise definition of the problem of ontotheology is this. Ontotheology is the inclusion of God as an entity within a metaphysical system such that God is reduced to a mere function within the system, only used to keep it logically consistent. God is then made the causal ground for all entities, including himself within the system, and therefore has to be his own self-cause. This, therefore, reduces God into a conceptual framework where he only serves as a causal explanation of all beings, while having an insufficient explanation for his own existence. Not only is his own existence rationally unsatisfying, His transcendence is robbed of him, making the God of ontotheology not one that a person of faith would ever desire to worship. This critique of Heidegger, therefore, would be an extremely devastating one to levy against Edith Stein's Finite and Eternal Being, should it apply to her proof for the existence of God. However, as will be shown, there are several elements to the argument Stein presents that prevent her work from falling into this problem. Instead, following after the philosophy of St. Thomas Aquinas, while also using her own phenomenological method, Stein presents an argument for the existence of God that is spared of any of the foundations needed for and called by ontotheology. This is done through 3 points contained within her approach. The first is that Stein does not include God as an entity among other entities, but rather treats her definition of being as it pertains to God and creatures as analogously. Second, Stein does not limit God to the strict role of being, the efficient cause and grounding of all other entities, but also introduces God as that which gives security, that which both sets and keeps entities in being. Finally, Stein, again drawing from Aquinas, does not hold that God is self-caused, but rather holds to the classical notion that God is pure act and being itself. The argument showing that Edith Stein's proof for God is not ontotheological can be formalized as this. If a given metaphysical system is to be called ontotheological, then it must include at least one of the 3 foundations of ontotheology. The 3 foundations of ontotheology are as follows: the inclusion of God within a metaphysical system as a mere entity among others, the placement of God as the efficient causal grounding of all entities within a system, and finally, the presentation of God as a self-caused entity. Edith Stein's proof for the existence of God does not include God as a mere entity among others within a metaphysical system, nor does her proof for the existence of God place God as the efficient cause and grounding of all entities. Finally, Edith Stein's proof for the existence of God does not present God as self-caused. Therefore, Edith Stein's proof for the existence of God does not include any of the 3 foundations of ontotheology, and Edith Stein's proof for the existence of God, therefore, is not ontotheological. Edith Stein's approach to the existence of God is an unconventional one, as it blends her background in phenomenology with Thomistic distinctions. Her method does not follow the complete logical rigor of the 5 ways, but begins with human experience. Similar to the proofs of God given by Descartes and St. Augustine, Stein begins with the subject and our own consciousness. It is natural for us to begin from the inescapable fact, the fact of our own being, as a starting point for any further philosophy, particularly any inquiry into the meaning of being, as Stein intends. Within the study of our consciousness, we notice that we are always perceiving the existence of an I am. This I is not to be found in a formula, such as Descartes' famous cogito ergo sum, but it rather lies within and behind all perceived actions. This I can be understood more concretely as the thing I perceive lying behind all my actions and perceptions. Prior to any thinking, doing, or perceiving, there has to be an ultimate subject whose existence is not dependent on the action, but whose actions are dependent on the existence of the subject. Therefore, It would have been more proper for Descartes to begin with I am, therefore I think. While the I is rather elusive, it remains the primary thing that is apprehended before any investigation into actions like thinking can be had. This certainty of one's own existence, then, is called my most original knowledge, not because it is temporally first in human experience, but because it is a certainty from which nothing further beyond itself, once thought reflects upon it, would be revealed. Once the I is revealed to us, we realize that this experience of the I is a temporal one, found within the boundaries of the past, the future, and the elusive and fleeting now. The framework of temporality is important within Stein's thought, especially in the gesturing to the existence of God that comes about through the I's experience of time. The experience of the now is categorized as being between a no longer of the past and a not yet of the future. In the tension between these two, the now constantly slips away, between both non-being and being. The now becomes for Stein an image archetype relation on which different ideas can come about from. These ideas appear to arrive in the mind not from logic or experience, but come about in the mind itself, ultimately combining in a gesture towards ideas of eternity and absolute being. In common parlance, we can say that before anything we do, we notice our own existence. After we notice our own existence, we notice that this existence is always measured in time. We consider how the past and future are experienced, and we notice that both seem to slip away as we travel on to the obscure now. Since our time is fleeting, our existence then also must be, and we therefore conceive of ideas that are not attributed to us, but something else. In seeing our time and existence slip away, we must ask the question, what would something be like if it did not have a limited existence, like me? It must be noted that these terms, such as being and existence, must always be understood via analogy. It may be worthwhile for a separate investigation to determine how Stein's ideas of the appearance of the I are different from Descartes' clear and distinct ideas. But I digress. For the purposes of this paper, the occurrence of the now gives rise to an idea, that of pure being, which does not experience the slippage between the past and future, non-being and being, but rather is timeless, eternal, and unchanging. These ideas, compared with our own experiences, give rise to the first effort of understanding the analogy of being championed by St. Thomas Aquinas. This analogy is to be understood in opposition to any univocal or equivocal account of being, where the attributing of being is either identical between God and creatures or completely different. Instead, being between God and creatures is a real similarity, but still holds in tension the transcendence of being itself, God, from our own finite participation in being. Momentary temporal being is seen as an image of the eternal being, God, who possesses his being in full, not mixed with any non-being, and is therefore pure act. These preliminary ideas, however, only open the door slightly to consider the possibility of a God who is eternal. Returning to the I, Stein states that while experiencing our temporality, we also undergo an awareness of our own fragility. which seems to disprove the possibility that the I's origin of existence is itself. We begin to observe breaks in our own experience that indicate that we are not our own maker. For example, our inability to recall or remember exact details of past events, or the anxiety we experience surrounding our own death, indicate that we do not hold our own being completely. We must ask the question, how could I presume to be my own cause when there are so many things within my experience and existence that appear to be lacking? Instead, we realize that, quote, the being of the I comes to life from moment to moment. It cannot stop, since it slips away unstoppably. Thus, it never truly comes to its own, to possess itself. Unquote. The I, then, cannot be the source of its own life, but rather experiences the present as something received, being kept alive by something other than itself. When considering where the I receives its being from, Stein lays out the possibility of either this reception coming from the outer, inner world of the I, or receiving its being from pure, eternal being. The first option does not exclude the second, and therefore Stein allows for secondary causality to exist within her system. In reference to the second option, we must find that the I is a null being, in that it constantly faces nothing, and therefore, quote, must, from moment to moment, be newly gifted with being. And yet this null being of mine is indeed being, and with it at every moment I touch the fullness of being. Unquote. This is to say that the I is constantly facing its own finitude and death, as observed by Heidegger in Being and Time. In facing our death, we must become aware that we ourselves are dependent in some way upon something which would not face death or nothingness in the same way we do. Rather, we reach out towards an idea of a fullness in opposition to our own incomplete finitude. The idea of fullness comes about then in seeing how the I desires an endless continuation of its own being and a desire to fully possess its own being. We do not want to die, yet have to struggle with this fact that we will, and therefore desire something which is unlike us. We must understand what is full, then, by our own deficiency, what is eternal by what is finite. While we do experience our own fragility, and this on an extreme level can lead to Heidegger's conception of angst, we typically have a more natural disposition of security, akin to a child trusting in their parents. In a similar way, the I for Edith Stein is kept in being, and it receives its being continuously as a gift from eternal being, pure act, God. Considering this as a whole, the being of the I is received and is not self-caused. The I is in a pose of reception, its temporal being in a constant state of needing to be given being, and the only thing capable of this gift is eternal being, God. Looking at this summary thus far of Stein's argument, it becomes possible for us to see how the pillars of ontotheology do not apply to her proof for the existence of God. To show that Stein does not include God as an entity among others, as proposed in the third premise of our formal argument, we must first address that much of Stein's language around God is within Aquinas's analogy of being. Metaphysically, God is understood not as an entity amongst others, but rather being itself, from which all entities derive their being from in a limited way. To speak of the being of God, therefore, is in no way an identical conversation to speaking about the being of trees, dogs, and humans. All of these are entities who have more or less being and are dependent upon God, who is not to be categorized along with his creation. Reflecting on the connection between the being of creatures and the I compared with that of God, Stein herself states, quote, "In contrast to the perfect unity of divine being, the being of creatures is broken, split. But despite the abyss separating them, there is commonness that allows us to speak of being in both. All that is, insofar as it is something after the manner of divine being. But all being, apart from the divine being, comes mixed with something of non-being. And this has consequences for everything in what is. God is pure act." Unquote. The precise language used by Stein in this passage shows the tension held when using analogous language around God. This tension allows her to avoid making univocal claims about God's being and creatures' being. Entities are set apart as having non-being within them, whereas God is pure act and therefore has no non-being within himself. Any shared commonality between attributes of entities and God can only be said when recognizing a greater difference between them than a similarity. It seems clear that Stein's God need not fall under the category of an entity given this emphasis of difference. Stein therefore is able to prevent God from being reduced to an entity within the metaphysical system amongst other entities, avoiding the first pillar of ontotheology. Premise 4 of our formal argument claims that Edith Stein's proof for the existence of God does not place God as the efficient causal grounding of all entities. By causal grounding of all entities, we mean that God's efficient causality is spoken of univocally as the same way the efficient causality of finite entities is said. Also, God's sole purpose within the metaphysical system is reduced to that of being a first cause. We may add that many other ontotheological systems fall into an occasionalism that denies the existence of secondary causes. All of these concerns are avoided in Stein's proof for the existence of God. Edith Stein does not treat creaturely causality and God's causality in a univocal way. As already established in premise 4, her borrowing of the analogy of being means that any actions of things that can be said of God are not to be said in a univocal way to creatures. Therefore, when Stein uses the language of receptivity and security to describe the being of the I in reference to eternal being, she is only demonstrating what that relationship is like in the style of simile, not an affirmative, all-encompassing statement. Stein also allows for the existence of secondary causality, that of the causes of being due partially to the inner and outer world of the I, which does not exclude the reception of being from God. This reception is again spoken of in an analogous way. The being we receive through the efficient cause of our parents is not the same reception of being given from God. God's efficient causality is a continuous action for Stein, one that we can see as the I is upheld through time. The being that gives grounding, therefore, is not simply reduced to solely the role of an efficient causal grounding. Stein speaks of many of the units of experience as also being received, along with each and every moment the I receives its being from God. Ironically, A certain reading of Stein's God and its interaction with creatures is close to Jean Luc Marion's saturated phenomena, a God of love and gift, while still holding to Aquinas' metaphysics as a causal force. Therefore, there is no room for a turn to deism that would be found in other ontotheological metaphysics. Premise 5 of our formal argument claims that Edith Stein's proof for the existence of God does not present God as a self-caused entity. This can be seen in that Stein's account of God states that God's essence is his existence, and that God is pure act. To be self-caused, for Stein, would likely imply a temporal process, or some type of logical priority, neither of which are included in God's being. If God's essence is his existence, there is no temporal progression in God. Stein's method of starting with a finite I makes this clear since we compare our finitude with the eternity of God. There is also no logical priority within God for Stein, unlike the progression seen with a system such as Hegel's. Again, the experience of the I reaches out to something that is not like itself, that does not experience the slipping of time, and also possesses the fullness of its being, which would eliminate any priority within God. Precisely due to premise 4 being true, we can demonstrate how if God is not an entity amongst others, the idea of him being his own cause is not possible. The principle of sufficient reason and Heideggerian demand for the grounding of all entities only applies to entities within the causal chains, not to being itself, which God is identified with in Stein's work. Much of Stein's avoidance of the third pillar of ontotheology, then, is drawn from her inheritance of St. Thomas Aquinas. However, her own method of experience of the I also helps to illustrate the distance between the experience of finite being and infinite eternal being. This distance is enough that the explanations and logic we apply to ourselves do not hold God completely or conceptually trap him in a loop of self-causation. While Edith Stein's proof of God is unique and avoids many of the common pitfalls of an ontotheological metaphysics, it is not immune from criticism. In objection to premise 4, a staunch Heideggerian could claim that while the language used by Stein includes concepts such as security, which are felt by the I in reference to God, her primary use of God within her proof is still that of a grounding, the cause of the I. Therefore, her work does fall under the second foundation of ontotheology, and therefore is an ontotheological proof. This is a worthwhile objection, and at times Stein does appear to be using language that reverts God back into a role of simply being an efficient cause for her I. However, this objection fails to disprove premise 4, when more elaboration is given to what is meant exactly by God's role as efficient grounding cause for all entities. Firstly, it would be absurd to declare that any primary first cause in a philosophical system would therefore warrant the whole project ontotheological. Marion defends Aquinas from being ontotheological and knows full well that God for Aquinas has a role in grounding entities through efficient causality. A more nuanced position admits that the second pillar of ontotheology is specifically criticizing the use of God as a grounding of entities when God has himself been categorized as also an entity. Furthermore, the second pillar makes its claim of being a problem based on the reduction of God solely to a metaphysical concept used to make all other beings possible. with a clearer understanding of what is really being contended by the second pillar of ontotheology, one can see how Edith Stein's work does not fall under its criticism. Much of her argument is directed towards the cultivation of faith, a dark path which includes an intimate experience of security in the arms of the deity. This language gestures at a role for God that far exceeds a simple causal relationship with entities. God's grounding also is a continuous action linked with his eternity and the finitude of the being of the I, which receives being always as a gift. This continuous care and dependence is not one of a removed, distant causal relation, since even the horizon of various units of experience the I has also must have their being given by God. None of God's causality removes the existence of secondary causes either, which could be another possible objection along the lines of disputing premise 4. Again, as has been demonstrated by premise 3 and its subsequent proof, Stein's work does not treat God as one entity among others, but rather exceeding such categorization. Another possible objection could be leveled at premise 5. An astute reader of Stein could claim that while the I discovers God through realizing its own finitude, and also discovers that the I itself is not self-caused, there is no good evidence to suggest that God himself is not self-caused. Furthermore, since our ideas of eternity and full possession of being come from our own limit, our temporal finitude and slipping of being, would it not stand that not being self-caused found within the I implies the idea of being self-caused found within God? This is also a very tricky objection, with its response dependent on the proof given in premise 3. God has been excluded from the list of entities in the world, and all language used about both God and creatures must be through analogy. The primary concern of the third pillar of ontotheology is this, that God is an entity and ground for all other entities and therefore is self-caused. This would create a contradiction on how God could ground all things while still grounding himself. Since he is not another entity, however, even if the I assented and admitted that God was possibly self-caused, this would not create the problem the pillar of ontotheology, the third, that seeks to show forth why the metaphysical system is impossible. Further, while a self-caused being could possibly be implied, this act of self-causing, however it may be conceived, will still fall short of the reality of God's nature due to the distance of analogy between God and any other entity. Furthermore, Stein's instance of God as pure act and possessing the fullness of his own being, unlike finite creation, does not seem to admit to him possibly being self-caused. As is classically understood, to be caused would require in some way the activation of a potency within a being. However, Stein states that no potency is present in God. Therefore, it would be impossible for God to have a cause, even if that cause be himself, since he lacks the potency that would need to be raised to act. Furthermore, if God possesses his being fully within eternity, then there could never have been a point previous to him in which he did not exist. This lack of a need for a point where he came to possess his being gestures that he would not need a cause, nor could he be self-caused. And therefore, this objection is refuted, and premise 5 still stands. As can be seen, Edith Stein's proof for God in her work Finite and Eternal Being, is not a work of ontotheology as defined by Martin Heidegger. Thus, Stein lays the groundwork for a philosophical approach to God that not only begins as an interesting dialogue between scholastic Thomism and personalist phenomenology, but also allows the transcendence of God to be held in tension with human reason and philosophical dialogue. Edith Stein's God is indeed worthy of our praise and worship, as well as our intellectual contemplation. Are you constantly bothering your close friends with the question of the meaning of being? Like, subscribe, and wander around your local parking garage.